Look at a map of Europe's biggest countries and count their major cities. Germany has 5, Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Cologne. Italy has 4, Spain has 3, France has 1, just 1. Paris holds 31% of the entire country's GDP, 1 in 5 French jobs, and the highest population density of any major city in Europe. But here is the strange part. The very thing that made Paris so powerful is the same thing that left the rest of France nearly empty. Because Paris was not built to be a great city. It was engineered to be the only city. And the blueprint is still visible today in the streets, the train lines, and a band of abandoned countryside that cuts the country in half. To understand how a single city bent an entire nation around itself, you have to start centuries before the boulevards or the train stations, with a decision most European kings refused to make. Medieval Europe was polycentric by default. Power was scattered. German princes kept courts in dozens of cities. Munich, Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, each one a center of gravity in its own right. Italian city-states competed fiercely. Florence against Venice, Milan against Naples, each commanding its own trade networks, its own armies, its own cultural identity. Spain had regional capitals with their own laws, their own languages, their own sense of self. This was the normal pattern across the continent. Power stayed distributed because no single ruler was strong enough to concentrate it all. But French monarchs made a different choice. Century after century, they pulled everything into Paris. Courts, universities, guilds, tax offices, legal institutions, cultural prestige. The process started early and it never stopped. Philip II moved the royal treasury to Paris in the late 11th century. The University of Paris became the intellectual center of Europe by the 12th century, drawing scholars and clergy from across the continent. By the time Louis XIV built Versailles in the late 1600s, the centralization was so extreme that ambitious people anywhere in France faced a binary decision: move to Paris or accept irrelevance. A talented lawyer in Lyon, a gifted artist in Marseille, a merchant with connections in Bordeaux, none of them could reach the top of their profession without eventually passing through the capital. The crown had made sure of it. No other major European country funneled power this tightly into one place. This was not geography doing the work. Mountains did not force this. Rivers did not demand it. It was political architecture, a deliberate, relentless concentration of gravity that would compound for 500 years. And once that gravity took hold, it started reshaping the city itself in ways no one expected. By the 1850s, Paris had a problem its own power created. Centuries of centralization had packed over 2 million people into a medieval street grid never designed to hold them. The neighborhoods behind the grand churches and palaces were a labyrinth of narrow alleys, open sewers, and crumbling tenements stacked 6 stories high. Disease spread constantly. Cholera killed tens of thousands. A social reformer described the city as an immense workshop of putrefaction, and he was not exaggerating. But the filth was not the real problem, at least not for the people in charge. The real problem was that those tight, winding streets were perfect for revolution, and Parisians kept proving it. In 1789, mobs surged through the alleys and toppled a monarchy. In 1830, barricades went up again and another king fell. In 1848, the pattern repeated. Cobblestones ripped from the ground, furniture dragged into the streets, narrow lanes turned into choke points where a few hundred armed citizens could hold off an entire regiment. Napoleon III looked at this cycle and decided to end it permanently. He gave Baron Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine, nearly unlimited authority to redesign the city from scratch. What followed was one of the most radical urban demolitions in history. Haussmann did not renovate Paris, he gutted it. Over roughly 2 decades, his crews demolished an estimated 20,000 buildings. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Homes, workshops, taverns, churches, centuries of accumulated life reduced to rubble and carted away. Somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 residents were displaced, pushed to the margins of the city or beyond. In their place rose wide, straight boulevards that cut through the old street grid like surgical incisions. The new avenues were broad enough for cavalry charges and artillery lines of fire. Sight lines stretched for hundreds of meters in perfect geometric alignment, making it impossible to build a barricade without being spotted from blocks away. Underground, Haussmann built a parallel city, new sewers, new water mains, new gas lines, all feeding the redesigned surface above. The postcard-perfect Paris that tourists photograph today. The creamstone facades, the uniform roof lines, the grand avenues converging on monumental squares, was literally engineered to make insurrection physically impossible. The beauty was a side effect. The purpose was control. And this impulse to design the city from the center outward did not stop at the streets. It scaled up to reshape the entire country. The centralization did not stop at politics and streets. In the 19th and 20th centuries, France built its entire transportation network as a single funnel pointing at Paris. Rail came first. The main lines radiated outward from the capital like spokes on a wheel. Paris to Lyon, Paris to Marseille, Paris to Bordeaux, Paris to Strasbourg. Then highways followed the same pattern. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, the TGV high-speed rail system locked it in permanently. Today, roughly 2,800 kilometers of high-speed track crisscross France, and almost all of it points at a single dot on the map. Want to travel from Lyon to Bordeaux, two major cities on opposite sides of the country? The fastest route goes through Paris. Toulouse to Strasbourg, through Paris. Nantes to Lille, through Paris. Even cities separated by just a few hundred kilometers often have no direct high-speed connection. The capital sits at the center of the web, and the web has no shortcuts around it. Stand in the Gare de Lyon and watch the departure board. Trains fan out to every corner of France. Stand in any provincial station and the board tells a simpler story. Paris, Paris, Paris. Now compare that to Germany, where high-speed trains connect Munich to Frankfurt, Hamburg to Berlin, Cologne to Stuttgart, city to city, without funneling through one hub. Italy's rail network links Milan, Rome, Naples, and Florence in a mesh. Spain connects Madrid, Barcelona, Seville, and Valencia in overlapping corridors. These countries built networks. France built a funnel. The rail system did not just reflect Paris's dominance, it reinforced it. Every provincial city became a satellite. Every journey reminded you where the center was. If you lived in Clermont-Ferrand and wanted to visit a friend in Dijon, the fastest way to get there was to travel away from your destination first, toward Paris, and then back out again. The geography of the rails reshaped the geography of daily life. And that funnel kept pulling people, money, ambition, inward, decade after decade, until the gap between Paris and everywhere else became almost impossible to reverse. But here is where the story flips. Because the very power Paris accumulated created a fracture inside the city itself. Paris proper, the official city, the Paris of postcards and government statistics, covers just 105 square kilometers. That boundary has barely moved since 1860. It was drawn when the city absorbed its surrounding villages and built a ring of fortifications. The walls came down long ago, but the administrative lines stayed frozen in place. The actual urban area, though, kept growing. Today it holds over 10.7 million people, spilling far beyond those old boundaries. And this is where the math gets strange. La Défense, the business district with its glass skyscrapers and corporate headquarters, technically not Paris, the sprawling university campuses and research labs, not Paris. The massive housing estates where millions of working-class families actually live, raise children, and commute to jobs in the center, separate municipalities with separate budgets, separate governance, and far less money. The numbers tell the story more bluntly than any map. The Métropole du Grand Paris, the governing body responsible for coordinating services across nearly 7 million suburban residents, operates on a budget of roughly 65 million euros. The tiny city of Paris itself, the 105 square kilometers inside the old boundary, about 8 billion euros. That is not a typo. The historic core has 120 times the budget of the body that governs the ring around it. No other major European capital has this kind of mismatch between its symbolic boundaries and its real ones. London's boroughs share governance through a powerful citywide authority. Berlin's districts operate under a unified municipal structure. Paris drew a line in 1860 and never moved it, and everything that happened on the other side of that line became someone else's problem. After the Second World War, France faced a housing crisis. Millions needed homes. Planners looked at the preserved, beautiful, impossibly dense historic core of Paris and made a decision that would echo for generations: push the new construction outward. Industry went to the suburbs. Mass housing went to the suburbs. The grand ensembles, those vast tower block estates built from reinforced concrete, rose in rings around the city, absorbing the working class and immigrant populations that the center could not or would not accommodate. A pattern emerged that is far sharper in Paris than in London, Berlin, or Madrid. A wealthy, tourist-filled, architecturally stunning center surrounded by peripheral estates that absorbed the social pressures the core did not want. The banlieues, as these suburbs are known, became home to millions of people who powered the Parisian economy but lived outside its walls and its budgets. Transit connections were designed to move people into the center for work, not to connect suburbs to each other. A resident of Clichy-sous-Bois, one of the most densely packed communities in the metropolitan area, could reach central Paris by commuter rail, but reaching a neighboring suburb 5 kilometers away might require 2 transfers and an hour on the bus. Services were thinner, investment was lower, parks were fewer. The physical distance from the grand boulevards was just a few kilometers, but the gap in resources felt like a different country. When unrest erupted in the banlieues in 2005 and repeatedly since, it was not random and it was not inexplicable. It was the predictable result of a design choice made decades earlier: preserve the center, export the stress. Other European capitals have inequality. Every large city does. But Paris architecturally separated its inequality, then drew a budget line between the two halves. The consequences of that separation are still unfolding, and when you zoom all the way out, the pattern gets even starker. The same gravity that pulled people into Paris pulled them out of everywhere else. Look at a population density map of France, and you will see something that does not exist in Germany, Italy, or Spain. A wide band of departments running from the southwest to the northeast with population densities under 30 people per square kilometer. The French call it the diagonale du vide, the empty diagonal. It cuts across the heart of the country like a scar. Towns along this band are aging fast. Young people leave for Paris or one of the handful of other metros that have managed to hold some gravity. Lyon, Toulouse, Bordeaux. Schools close, doctors retire without replacements, bakeries and post offices shut down. Train stations that once connected these places to the national network have been downgraded or abandoned entirely. Platforms cracking, ticket windows shuttered, timetables offering 2 or 3 services a day where there used to be a dozen. Services thin out until the villages that remain feel more like museums than living communities. Drive through the Creuse, the Gers, or the Nièvre, and you pass through town after town where the population has halved since 1960. Stone houses sit empty with faded shutters. A cafe stays open 3 days a week because there are not enough customers for more. It is as if someone tilted the country and everything slid toward one corner. This pattern barely exists in Germany, where mid-sized cities like Stuttgart, Leipzig, Nuremberg, and Hanover keep population distributed across the map. Each one has its own industries, its own universities, its own cultural pull. It barely exists in Italy, where Milan, Naples, Turin, and Bologna each hold regional gravity strong enough to keep people from draining toward Rome. France's empty diagonal is the shadow cast by Paris's light, a direct geographic consequence of 500 years of centralization, visible from space as a dark band cutting across the country. France knows this is a problem. The Grand Paris Express, described as the largest metro project currently under construction in the world, is building 4 new orbital lines around the capital. Nearly 200 kilometers of track and 68 new stations, lines that connect suburbs to each other instead of funneling everything through the center. For the first time in the history of Parisian transit, the design philosophy is shifting from spoke and hub to network. Stations are being placed in communities that have never had direct rapid transit connections to their neighbors. The promise is that a resident of Saint-Denis could reach Saclay or Versailles without ever passing through central Paris. A commuter in Bobigny could get to Villejuif in 20 minutes instead of an hour. At the same time, the so-called 15-minute city policies aim to give individual neighborhoods their own gravity. Enough shops, services, schools, and green space that residents do not need the center for every errand. The idea is to create dozens of small poles of attraction across the metro area, breaking the gravitational monopoly of the historic core. But undoing 500 years of compounding centralization with a single rail project is an enormous gamble. The stations could spark inclusive growth in long-neglected suburbs. Or they could simply gentrify a handful of nodes, pushing property values up around new stops, while the deeper structural imbalance remains untouched. The budget gap between Paris and its suburbs will not close because a new train line opens. The empty diagonal will not fill because commute times improve on the urban fringe. The question hanging over all of it is the hardest one. Can you reverse a pattern this old, or has the gravity become permanent? Paris is simultaneously one of the most walkable, transit-rich, culturally dense cities on Earth, and the apex of a system that hollowed out the country around it. Inside its 105 square kilometers, it is a global model for urban living. Compact, beautiful, layered with history. Outside them, it is a cautionary tale for national planning, a case study in what happens when one city absorbs all the light. Other European capitals spread their weight. Berlin shares Germany with Munich, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Cologne. Rome shares Italy with Milan, Naples, and Turin. Madrid shares Spain with Barcelona and Valencia. Paris does not share, it concentrates. And that concentration made it magnificent and made France lopsided. The beauty and the imbalance are not separate stories. They are the same story. The wide boulevards designed to crush barricades, the radial train lines that funnel a nation through one hub, the preserved stone core surrounded by neglected suburbs, the empty diagonal stretching across the countryside, all of it traces back to one recurring choice, made over and over for 5 centuries. Put everything in Paris. The most romanticized city in the world is also the most engineered. And the country shaped around it is still living with the consequences, magnificent at the center and fading at the edges.